We'll start with the reveal.stk solution that we created in the previous video. Since we'll be using SQL Server in this example, the first thing that we'll want to do is right-click on our project, manage NuGet packages, and add the SQL Server dependency required by Reveal. We'll browse for reveal.stk.data.sq, and we will see the reveal.stk.data.microsoft SQL Server package, and we'll click Install, and we'll accept the defaults. And at this point, we have enabled SQL Server for this application. If we look at all of the data sources that are available, you have Oracle, Box, Dropbox, Snowflake, and we'll continue to scroll down and see all of the others. There's about 30 data sources total with Reveal. Some of them are grouped together in different assemblies and packages, but overall, the documentation will tell you what you need to do to install the correct package for your application. So now that we have SQL Server added, let's go ahead and tell Reveal to register that data source to make it available to our application. So we're going to modify our addControllers.addReveal here. So what we want to do is use the datasources.register method, which is what you'll have to do with all of your data sources that you're using in your application. So in this case, we'll say builder, and then we're going to do a .datasources.register Microsoft SQL Server, and there we go. That's all we need to do to say, hey, application SQL Server is available and you should use it. If you have other data sources like SharePoint, like Oracle, whatever, you'll just keep on using a register syntax to register that data source based on the packages that you've added. In this case, since we're only using SQL Server, we're good to go here. Next, we'll add two classes that are fundamental to enabling data access and authentication in your application. So I'm going to right-click on my project. I'm going to add a new folder. I'm going to call this core. And in my core folder, I'm going to add two class libraries, one called the Authentication Provider. The Authentication Provider is where we will add our username, password, authentication information to our SQL Server. And then I will add my Data Source Provider. Both of these implement interfaces from Reveal to aid in your application code to access your data. So the first thing we'll do in the Authentication Provider is we'll implement an interface for the IRV Authentication Provider. The IRV Authentication Provider includes the Resolve Credentials async, which allows you to create different credential types to authenticate against your data source. So let's go ahead and remove the throw new exception. And what we want to do is create a variable for our data source credential. So we'll call it credential. And this isn't going to be null because what we're going to do is use the username password data source credential object, which allow us to pass a username and password. There are different types of credentials that you can use. So if we just go to credential, you can see we have a headers data source credential, bearer token, Amazon Web Services. So based on the type of data source that you're using, you would use a specific data source credential authentication method. So in this case, we're going to check to see what our data source is and then add the correct credential. So I'm going to say if the data source is an RV SQL Server data source, there's two options you can use here, the SQL Server data source or the Azure SQL data source. Or if you're going to switch between them, there is also a SQL-based data source. So the key is whatever you use, you have to be consistent. In our case, since I know I'm going to connect to an Azure SQL database, I'm going to say if this is an Azure SQL data source. So I have to make sure on my client, I specify that's in an Azure data source. And then in my data source provider, I have to use my Azure SQL data source. So then next we'll just tell our credential that it needs to be a new RV username password data source credential. And let's go ahead and pass it our username and password. And then we will return task from result. And then we want to just return credential. So in this case, I'll just pop in my username and my password, and I'm good to go. So I will use the authentication provider when I'm attempting to connect to my data source inside of my data source provider. So in the data source provider, I want to implement the IRV data source provider. And what this does is it adds two methods, change data source async and change data source item async. So in change data source async, that's where we're going to put what reveal needs for the connection string to the database. So we'll go ahead and remove our throw new exception, and we're going to do the same thing as we did before. We're going to check to see what the data source is, and then based on that, we will add some information. So I'm going to say here, if my data source, and where is that coming from? If we look over here, we have data source. User context is something that we're going to cover in another lesson. Right now, we're just going to focus on data source and data source item. So here, if I say if the data source is what, if it's an Azure SQL data source, and we'll call this SQL DS for SQL data source, there's going to be two properties that I need to set. We'll do SQL DS.host. And what will the host be? In my case, I'm going to use my Azure SQL instance, which is jbarris.database.windows.net. And then I'm going to say use the SQL DS.database, and that should be Northwind Cloud is what mine is called. If I jump over to the browser and I open up Azure, I'll go to my SQL databases. Here we have Northwind Cloud, and this is the database that we're going to be using in this example today. So I have all my tables, views, stored procedures, etc., and that's what we're connecting to. This particular instance for development is tied to my IP address. So when you're doing SQL Azure, you have all kinds of different firewall rules and capabilities that you can enable for security. I have a firewall rule that is specific to my IP address for accessing the Northwind Cloud database. So once that's done, we are going to return our result, and it'll be data source. So there we go. So this is all I need to do to connect to my Azure SQL instance. Now in the change data source item async, we're going to do something similar. I'm going to also check to see if my data source item is an Azure SQL data source item, and we'll call this SQL DSI. And if it is a SQL data source item, I'm going to check the incoming ID of this particular SQL data source item. And if it matches a string variable, for example, I want to do a specific query. So in this case, I'm going to say if SQL DSI.ID equals invoices, then I'm going to set a couple properties. So I want to say SQL DSI.table equals invoices. And we'll say SQL DSI.title equals invoices from Azure. And you'll see where that comes into play on the server side. And that's all I'm going to do here. And then we'll do the same thing. We'll do a return task from result, data source item. Why does this matter? It matters because on the client, you're going to offer the user a curated list of data sources or the entire database to build dashboards from. In the example we're going to do now, I am going to specifically offer the user a data source item called invoices that will get them right into the dashboard designer for them to create a dashboard. They will also have access to the full database if you give that to them on the client. Before we test this out, we need to register our data source provider and our authentication provider in program.cs. So in the same way that we added our data sources, we'll add our authentication provider, and this will be just authentication provider. And we'll add our data source provider. And for a quick review, we've enabled our server application by adding the Reveal SDK. We're registering our authentication provider and our data source provider along with our SQL Server provider. We are enabling a CORS policy so we can access data from the client at a different URL. And we also added use authorization and map controllers. In the authentication provider, we checked our data source, and if it was an Azure SQL data source, we pass it a specific username and password. In the data source provider, we set the connection string properties for our database, and we're doing a specific query against the invoices table if the incoming ID is for invoices. Now, before we run this, there's a key line of code that's missing. In your change data source item async, in order to ensure that the specific data source item that's coming across has the host and database populated, you need to call change data source async. So we're going to go ahead and call that here. So let's do a change data source async. And what we want to pass is the user context, and we're going to pass the SQL DSI, our data source, .data source. And with that, we will ensure that our host and database are populated in this specific Azure SQL database item. We're getting a red squiggly here. I noticed that I must have implemented my interfaces explicitly when we created these methods. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that. So I'm going to make these public, and I'm going to get rid of the fully qualified method name. And there we go. We get rid of our squiggly, and we are ready to go. So let's go ahead and run this. And we'll get the same Swagger file that we did in our previous demos. So let's click try it out. Let's just make sure that we can still access our sales dashboard. And you can see there's the JSON for our sales R- file. Now what I want to do is test our access to our SQL Server database. So let's right-click anywhere here and open folder in File Explorer. I am going to go to my Downloads folder, and I have an index.html here that we're going to open up with Visual Studio Code. What we're doing here is this is a typical client view of a Reveal implementation for adding a new record. We're going to go into the details of this in another video, but what we are adding here is the data source, the Azure SQL data source, and then our Azure SQL data source item. A key thing to remember is I said in the server, if the data source item.id equals invoices, then set the table name to invoices. So in the client, we're not setting any confidential information. We're basically setting up maybe tags or IDs, titles, subtitles that we'll then use on the server to determine how to query the database. The way that these items are presented to the end user is through the Reveal data sources callback. And this is an array that takes the data source, which is optional, and then the data source items, which again are optional. I don't need to have the full data source, and maybe I just have a full data source and not a data source item. It's really up to you. One important thing here is the set base URL is pointing to localhost 7024. If we look at our Swagger file, it is localhost 7024. So you have to make sure all of that lines up. So now if I right-click and view this in the browser, this is your entry point for creating a new dashboard in Reveal. I will click plus visualization. If I select invoices under data items, this will take me right into the visualization editor. So for example, I can do country as my label, and let's do the freight cost by country. And this created a nice dashboard for me. Maybe I want to change this from sum aggregation to average. I can change the title of this to average freight, like so. I will update this field. Now I have the average freight by country. Note that by changing the value name, it also changed the name in the tooltip. So when I hover over, I have a nice explanatory tooltip. I'll check the box on this and we'll click plus visualization again, and I'll go to my full database. So let's click Azure SQL Database. And now you can see that I have all of my tables and all of my views available to me. as well as my stored procedures. So all of this is available to me when I allow the entire database to be displayed to the user. If I don't want the entire database, if I go back to Visual Studio Code, I can simply remove this from the array, and this is just going to show the data source item. Now, when I view this in the browser, we'll click plus visualization, and we just see the single data source item there. The point here is that everything that you're displaying in this callback is set up through curated data source items. So let's say, for example, I want to have an additional data source item. I will copy this, and let's call this data source item 2. And I'm going to call this orders. So the ID will be orders, the title, orders, and this will be a table-based query. So now if we go back to our server, I'll hit stop. In our change data source item async, why don't we copy this block of code, Control C, and instead of setting table, I'm going to say if the ID equals orders, I'm going to set the custom query property equals select star from orders. And we'll change this title to orders from Azure, and that will be it. So now in the incoming ID of orders, we're going to do this custom query. So let's run this. We'll go back to Visual Studio Code. In order for this to show up in our dialog, we will add the second Azure SQL data source item. So we have 1 and 2. Let's right click, open this in our default browser. And in fact, let me make sure I save that. Open in default browser, plus visualization. Now you see invoices and orders. So now if I click orders, this gives me the orders table. Similar information to the invoices table, but you get the point that if you have an item on the client that you want to populate in the data sources dialog, make sure that you are adding it on the server, and you could use custom query. And in fact, for SQL Server, you can use a stored procedure with procedure parameters, which will allow you further granularity in what you're selecting from the server. In the video on row-level security, we will look at the user context setting, which is something that you're passing around in the change data source item async and in the change data source async, and how you can set properties on the user context to pass as parameters to, for example, queries or stored procedures to do row-level security.